The other striking thing is that for those national grants programs, it was actually seats held by independents and minor parties that saw the greatest per capita funding. And that goes to show how self-defeating this pork barrelling can be, because what that really does is send a message to safe coalition seats that you're going to miss out unless you become marginal. There's a sting in the tail there.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains politics, policy and economics in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and it's been another big week in Parliament, with the Stage 3 tax cuts changes expected to pass the Senate very soon, the data on Australia's gender pay gap coming out, and independent MP Helen Haines has introduced a new private member's bill to Parliament. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the days of pork barrelling dominating politics and the headlines were over, but the Albanese government is being challenged this week to support an anti-pork barrelling bill from independent MP Helen Haines. Listeners will likely remember the former coalition government was involved in a series of pork barrelling scandals, like sports rorts and the car parking rorts, and those are the kinds of scandals that this bill is designed to prevent.
Let's talk pork barrelling.
Pork barrelling.
The term pork barrelling is common parlance, and if that's the accusation made on this occasion, I'm happy to accept that commentary.
Let's not accept this as a feature. It is a flaw in our democracy.
But it's infected all levels of politics.
And the pork barrelling is just out of control.
The shameless pork barrelling is unlikely to stop, given the government knows it's got some catching up to do in key marginal seats.
95% of the $252 million went to coalition-held seats.
Huge disparity between what Labor and coalition electorates received through government grants involving ministerial discretion.
This was a fund in your program, under your remit as Minister. Was this deliberately targeting marginal seats you wanted to do?
I am proud to introduce the Accountability of Grants, Investment Mandates and Use of Public Resources Amendment, End Pork Barrelling Bill.
So to take us through the details and what the bill might mean for transparency and integrity, I'm joined by the Director of our Democracy and Accountability Program here at the Australia Institute, Bill Brown. G'day, Bill.
Hey, Eb.
So, Bill, I want to start out with what exactly is pork barrelling, because it sounds like this kind of benign, almost fun kind of a term. But what is it really? What do we mean when people say pork barrelling?
So pork barrelling, or misuse of public money, is when public money is spent on local projects, mostly with an eye to getting some kind of electoral advantage. So government comes in and it funds projects often in marginal seats. They're often flashy projects that can attract a big announcement that draws a lot of media. But if you look at the merits of those projects, they don't necessarily stack up compared to others that the government could be funding instead.
Yeah, so what you've just described there, I mean, saying a misuse of public money sounds quite different to this kind of, it's a quaint term, really, pork barrelling.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the term pork barrelling goes back to the 19th century. It feels folksy.
It does feel folksy.
And integrity experts, including Geoffrey Watson, have been at pains to recast it as misuse of public money to take away that folksy angle.
Yeah, it really puts it in a different light compared to how the word sounds. So Helen Haines has introduced a private member's bill about pork barrelling.
Pork barrelling undermines public trust in governments and in politicians who are elected to make decisions on our collective behalf, in the public interest and for the common good. It undermines our trust in democracy. It perpetuates the cynicism in the community that giving your vote is about getting stuff rather than getting good policy.
What is the bill designed to do? What are the key provisions of it?
Helen Haines' private members bill is really focused at increasing the transparency and oversight around grants programs. Whenever there's talk about limiting what kinds of grants can be distributed, there's pushback on the basis that you don't want to limit the government's ability to respond to an emergency, and you don't want to limit what people can promise in an election campaign and get the sanction of voters for. Where I think Helen Haines' bill is really savvy is it leaves the question of banning or allowing grants programs to one side and says, whatever grants you give, you have to be accountable for. You have to publish the circumstances under which these grants were made. The government of the day has to take responsibility for them, and you set up a parliamentary committee that can take a look at what grants are being paid out and ask those probing questions like, is this really value for money?
Yeah, because when it comes to value for money, I guess that's what's at stake, isn't it? It's public money that taxpayers collectively have funded, and it should be spent on things that are in the public benefit, not for the benefit of whichever, party is in government. And I just want to go back to some of those scandals that we saw under the previous coalition government, because there, as you were talking about, we really did see kind of primarily they were trying to get an electoral benefit, essentially to buy votes with these kinds of projects. And, it was quite obvious in many respects. There was that colour-coded system that I think Andrew Probyn uncovered, where this kind of funding is disguised as, this is, in the Australian public's benefit, but actually it was just being funneled towards marginal seats. Is that kind of an accurate representation of what was happening?
I think that's a fair representation. And it's even visible from the kinds of projects that the Commonwealth government, which manages $400 billion or more a year, was involving itself in. Whether a particular oval gets a change room, whether there's a car park built in a particular place. These are actually not decisions that the Commonwealth government is set up to be making in the most part. And the fact that it was involving itself at that level shows how much value it placed on those small community projects.
And Bill, I know that the Australia Institute has looked at some of how these grants programs, particularly those where there's ministerial discretion, where a minister can intervene and kind of go against recommendations or any kind of a process that had been in place. What did that research find?
Back in 2021, Australia Institute researchers looked at the bulk of information that we could get about 7 grants programs. As you say, we're interested in grants programs with ministerial discretion, where the government is interfering in the process. And we wanted to look at large programs. We looked at 7 programs, some regional and some with national scope, overall involving billions of dollars of money being distributed. And what we found is that these grants skewed overwhelmingly to coalition seats and to marginal seats at the expense of safe seats and seats held by other parties and in some cases by independents as well.
Marginal seats and priority seats for the election received a disproportionate number of grants, more than half in the first round. Hundreds of programs that scored poorly against Sports Australia's selection criteria were funded, but the government argued it was not pork barrelling.
So that's the electoral calculation, but also there's this idea that maybe it's not going not just to people who vote for the other parties, but to the communities who might need that funding for that change room at their oval the most. It's not really going where the money is needed, but where it's going to do the most benefit for the coalition.
Exactly right. Even if you do think that the government should be involved in funding these kind of micro projects, it should do so based on need, not based on this electoral calculation.
Yeah. So I guess that's really important. And, I think even Gladys Berejiklian, when she appeared before ICAC, more or less said, pork barrelling is just what everyone expects.
Described it as an announcement which was good for the community insofar as providing facility, but also politically curry favour with the community. And that's, at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, that's democracy.
You didn't actually care about the detail of the proposal because you took the view that the appropriate course to win the Wagga by-election was to just throw money at Wagga.
I wouldn't say just throw money, but it's a regular political activity that governments try to win seats, try to keep their seats, as do opposition. So I don't think it's a surprise to anybody in and around government to know that we threw money at seats in order to keep them.
But we've asked the public what they think about this issue. What did the polling show, Bill?
We went to Australians and asked them what they perceived as corrupt conduct by governments, and asked them allocating public money to projects in marginal seats in order to win votes. Overwhelmingly, Australians considered that corrupt conduct. 4 in 5, or 81%, said it was corrupt conduct, and only 12% said it was not corrupt conduct. That's a pretty clear message from Australians that they're not interested in this kind of behaviour. And I think it makes sense. Australians don't want money to be distributed based on which electorate you live in, knowing that they'll have friends and family in other places who might be more deserving, who'll be missing out.
I did want to ask about, this is, a private member's bill, obviously, but we have seen this Labor government make some strides in terms of establishing a National Anti-Corruption Commission. It's looking at reviewing the process for appointments to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. We've had a series of things that the Australia Institute has been advocating for to really improve transparency and accountability in government. And to fight corruption. But this is a private member's bill. It's not coming from the government. Is there an appetite in the parliament for this kind of integrity change?
I think there's a strong appetite to clean up the grants process, and the criticism that the Morrison government in particular copped at the last election for its use of grants programs will, I think, be on the mind of the Albanese government as well. One thing Helen Haines' private members bill does is draw on a bill that Katie Gallagher proposed in opposition with similar transparency requirements. And I think by framing it as something that the Labor government has asked for in the past, she's made her case much harder for them to ignore. We know that while private members' bills themselves are very rarely voted up, governments often borrow from them, and the National Anti-Corruption Commission's a perfect example of that. Both Helen Haines and her predecessor, Cathy McGowan, pursued that through private members' bills and put pressure on the major parties.
And we don't have consistently clear, transparent selection criteria which are publicly available. We don't have mandatory reporting to the Parliament. We don't have any parliamentary oversight. So they're the aspects of my bill that I want to see passed.
So, Bill, this is, as we said, kind of one of a number of integrity measures that the Parliament has been looking at. What is still on the to-do list in terms of strengthening Australia's democracy and some of our democratic systems?
There's a lot still to go, I have to say. A major one would be more transparency around political donations and other political contributions. At the moment, our disclosures take place very delayed, and the donation disclosure threshold is very high. So a lot of payments slip under the radar. That system really needs to be cleaned up. In addition, the government's proposed replacement for the Administrative Appeals Tribunal still needs a lot of consideration around how that process can be made independent and free from politicisation. And finally, I'd say the Australian Broadcasting Corporation needs more funding, and for the appointments process to its board to be guaranteed to be an independent process, not one that's subject to government override.
Yeah, because we have seen that in the past, and obviously everyone loves our ABC. It is the public broadcaster along with SBS and NITV, but yeah, we have seen in the past that that's become very politicised, and of course Ida Buttrose is coming to the end of her term as chair of the board.
That's right, and to its credit, the Albanese government has been personally good about making its appointments to the ABC board, including the incoming chair, Kim Williams, through an independent process. But the option for the minister or prime minister to override that process still exists. And really you want to make sure that that's future-proof and doesn't just depend on the individual minister of the day.
According to the Australia Institute, more than 80% of Australians view pork barrelling as a form of corruption. And contrary to what many politicians say, Voters don't like it and they don't want it.
Bill, we've talked about that research that the Australia Institute did into grants with ministerial discretion. Are there any kind of big figures out of that you think the audience really needs to know about? Because as we know, these were pretty shocking scandals at the time.
Of the 7 grants programs we looked at, there was $3.9 billion distributed, and 71% of that, $2.8 billion, went to coalition-held seats. Just 23% went to Labor-held seats and 6% to seats from independents and minor parties. The other striking thing is that for those national grants programs, it was actually seats held by independents and minor parties that saw the greatest per capita funding. And that goes to show how self-defeating this pork barrelling can be, because what that really does is send a message to safe coalition seats that you're going to miss out unless you become marginal. There's a sting in the tail there.
Thanks, Bill. I think that's all we've got time for.
Thanks, Eb.
This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 27th of February 2024, and things may have changed since recording. In 2024, the Australia Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary as Australia's leading think tank. That's 30 years of big ideas. If you enjoy the big ideas we talk about on Follow the Money or Australia Institute research like what we've been discussing today about pork barrelling, please consider becoming a regular giver from as little as $10 a month at australiainstitute.org.au. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Bill is at Brown90, that's Brown with an E. And our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions.